Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 10, Psychological Disorders. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about what is a psychological disorder, what makes something a disorder. We're going to go through a pretty lengthy list of different psychological disorders and discuss each one. And then we'll talk a little bit about just the prevalence of psychological disorders and how those vary across different cultures and areas of the world. All right, let's go ahead and jump into it. So Chapter 10, Psychological Disorders. So the first question we need to ask ourselves is when we're talking about psychological disorders, what is truly considered abnormal behavior or abnormal? And so when we think about something that's different or strange or abnormal, how do we define that it is actually different than something that's normal? And how can we classify things as an actual disorder if it's different from the normal? And this might be hard or challenging to think through and think, where is that line between what's normal and what's abnormal? And so to do this, we kind of have this structured method of going about it and what we call the 4 Ds of psychological disorders. And those are danger, or how much this poses a threat to oneself or someone else. Deviance, so again, how negative the aspect or the behaviors are. Dysfunction, does it cause problems on a day-to-day or reciprocal or cycling nature? And distress, is it something that causes some psychological distress or discomfort in the individual? And with these 4 things together, we can look at behaviors and identify, do they meet criteria in each of these 4 conditions? And if they do, then we can classify them as abnormal and as a psychological disorder. Now, one of the things too that's important to talk about when talking about psychological disorders is stigma, or negative connotation towards these disorders. And this is something that's been a challenge since the first identified psychological disorders, because we look at people with these oftentimes through a negative light or through a negative lens. And this can cause lots of harmful aspects, both in just the way people are treated, but also in their ability to get help and seek help when identifying these different disorders. If there's a negative connotation towards some disorder, people are going to be less likely to share and identify as having that disorder. And so there have been a series of organizations and groups that have helped to try and reduce the negative stigma associated with different psychological disorders. And I think these are great. These are a great way to, again, reduce these stigmas so that people can feel more confident, more comfortable seeking help and advice when struggling from these different disorders. And the last thing we'll talk about here is word choice, and how word choice really does matter in helping to reduce and minimize the stigmas associated with different psychological disorders. And so we talk about how we like to use people first language in classifying and discussing disorders in this context. So for example, we might say someone has schizophrenia rather than saying they are schizophrenic, is sort of an example of identifying them through people first word choices. And then also it's important to identify that how we classify things and how we refer to things changes throughout the years. So how we might have called a disorder in the past might no longer be generally acceptable, and we might have to refer to it in sort of a new context today.